Who are you?
Demons to some, angels to others.
Hellraiser is a legendary horror franchise, no doubt about that, but it also happens to be a giant puzzle box of unanswered questions. Across its many sequels, which range from brilliant to, well, not so brilliant, the franchise introduced some great concepts and then often dropped them without explanation. From the rules of Pinhead and his Cenobite pals to the ever-shifting mechanics of that cursed puzzle box, the Hellraiser movies have left many unanswered questions, and in this video, we'll be exploring the 10 most frustrating questions that the franchise never bothered to explain. But before we begin, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Those 2 small clicks from you will help us tremendously in bringing you more of these marvelous videos in the future. So now, let's begin.
It was a mistake!
You solved the box. We came. Now you must come with us.
What are the true rules governing the Cenobites? One of the biggest mysteries in Hellraiser is how the Cenobites, those leather-clad, extra-dimensional sadomasochists led by Pinhead, actually operate. In the first 2 films, there's a clear, if unstated rule, which says that they only come when called. Solve the Lament Configuration, and voila, they arrive to drag you off for an eternity of exquisite torture. In fact, Pinhead and his followers follow certain rules. We see this when Kirsty bargains with Pinhead in the original film. She opens the box accidentally and pleads for mercy, and in return for that mercy, she offers to lead them to Frank, the one who intended to summon them. Surprisingly, Pinhead agrees to this deal, which shows that the Cenobites can be reasoned with and are bound by a certain code of honor, albeit a very thin one. In Hellbound, Hellraiser 2, the rules are more explicitly explained through a young girl named Tiffany. She solves the puzzle box under duress. Pinhead calls off his Cenobites, stating, "It's not hands that call us, it's desire." In other words, an innocent solving the box doesn't count. Only those who truly want to open it are fair game. This implies that the Cenobites are basically cosmic BDSM genies, and they only take you if you asked for it, on some level at least. They spare Kirsty after she fulfills her promise to deliver Frank, so this means that they also honor their word. If it were up to us, we would describe them as lawful evil, and that means that they have a certain demonic code of conduct that they have to follow. However, as the series progresses, these rules start to wobble. By the 3rd film, for reasons we'll touch on soon, Pinhead goes full slasher villain and all bets are off. Like good bureaucrats, the Cenobites usually stick to protocol, and they don't bother anyone who hasn't fiddled with Le Marchand's magical cube. At least, that was the idea originally. How do the Cenobites choose their victims? Given those rules we just explained, the obvious answer should be that their victims choose themselves by opening the box. In the first 2 films, that's pretty much how it works. However, anyone who's watched the later Hellraiser sequels knows this consistency went out the blood-stained glass window. By Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth, the franchise does a total 180. Here, Pinhead is unchained, both literally and metaphorically, and starts killing indiscriminately like he's trying to beat Freddy Krueger's kill count. In that film, Pinhead gets separated from his human soul and loses any restraint or so-called rules he once had. In the aftermath, he becomes the demonic version of a trigger-happy man and slaughters a nightclub full of people who definitely didn't solve any puzzle boxes. Safe to say that he was now choosing victims left and right on a bloody whim. Clearly, without Spencer's moral code, Pinhead becomes a pure evil entity who no longer plays by the old rules. He even creates new Cenobites out of random club-goers just because he can. Actually, correction, these were more precisely pseudo-Cenobites since they weren't made in the Labyrinth. Anyways, the question that now arises is, how did these Cenobites choose victims? Well, whoever's in front of them was fair game, and this is a huge change from the original concept. The inconsistency continues in later installments. Sometimes Pinhead goes back to being a stickler for "you opened it, I take you." For example, in Hellraiser Inferno, there was a detective who did meddle with the box and found himself trapped in a personal hell of Pinhead's making. Other times, Cenobites kill secondary characters who never even touched the box simply because they're collateral or bargaining chips. For instance, in Hellseeker, Pinhead is more than happy to torment Kirsty's no-good husband, who definitely didn't summon him. Kirsty did. So, asking how do the Cenobites choose their victims basically gives us 2 answers depending on which movie you watch. In the early original story from the first 2 movies, victims essentially volunteer by seeking forbidden pleasure and opening the gateway to hell. Well, in later entries, the franchise basically ignores its own rule.
My God. Leviathan, Lord of the Labyrinth.
What is the true nature of hell and Leviathan? Clive Barker doesn't describe his hell in a straightforward Christian way with the fire, brimstone, and a guy with big red horns. Instead, he gives us something arguably worse in the form of this cold labyrinthine dimension ruled by a bad dude named Leviathan. But the interesting part is that Leviathan favors order, and endless torment of course, over chaos and anarchy. In Hellbound, Hellraiser 2, we finally see this hell and it looks pretty much like a giant maze, overseen by Leviathan. He's represented as a massive dark geometric shape spinning in the sky. We think it was interesting, something novel and very different from the run-of-the-mill version of the devil. Leviathan is described as a god, not Satan per se, but a deity of flesh, order, and suffering who commands the Cenobites. In that film, Hell is called the Labyrinth, and it's an actual place the Cenobites come from and return to, and it's also where all the torture takes place, and each of these torture chambers is tailored to each victim's psyche. In other words, it's a bespoke hell for each soul trapped here, and the Cenobites are basically the delivery service to get you there. In fact, the Cenobites say they're demons to some, angels to others, which means that what they offer could be heaven or hell depending on your perspective. So it's only called hell because to some of its prisoners it might as well be, but for someone who craves the Cenobites' brand of pain pleasure, it could be considered a twisted kind of heaven. Moreover, we know that Leviathan's realm is more about eternal experiences and the extremes of sensation than about punishing sinners for sin's sake. In Hellraiser 2, Pinhead even goes on to say that they are explorers and should not be undermined as damned souls. Clearly, hell in this franchise is complicated, and there's even talk of multiple hells or personal hell dimensions. In Hellseeker, for example, Pinhead tells Kirsty that her father Larry is in his own hell, separate from the Cenobite Labyrinth. Leviathan itself remains largely unknown. We know he, or it, sits at the center of the Labyrinth, and that the Cenobites serve it like devotees serving a dark god, and you can actually draw some parallels between how Cenobites treat Leviathan and how the Death Eaters treat Voldemort in Harry Potter. As we already mentioned, Leviathan has an obsession with order and pain. The second film's Doctor-turned-Cenobite, Shenard, calls Leviathan the god of flesh, hunger, and desire, which about sums it up. But after Hellraiser 2, guess what? The films pretty much abandoned Leviathan entirely, much like they did everything else that made the franchise so lovable. None of the later sequels even mention Leviathan by name, as if that entire setup never existed. The true nature of Hell in Hellraiser thus depends on which installment you're looking at, and they reduce the Labyrinth to a mere torture chamber bereft of the deeper lore and backstory. What happened to the mysterious dragon creature? Ah yes, the bone dragon, as some people like to call it, from the end of the first Hellraiser. Even if you don't lie awake at night wondering what on earth that winged skeleton thing was and why it snatched the puzzle box and flew away, we're here to answer the question for you. In the final scene of Hellraiser, a vagrant who'd been stalking Kirsty throughout the movie reveals his true form. He transforms into a skeletal dragon-like creature, takes the Lament Configuration from the rubble, and flies away into the night. The movie gives zero explanation, leaving us all thinking we missed something. So what was that about? The short answer is that the creature is essentially a guardian of the puzzle box, an agent of Hell, or Leviathan, whose job is to ensure the Lament Configuration continues its evil little journey to the next victim. In fact, the bearded vagrant seen earlier eating crickets in Kirsty's pet store was the dragon in disguise all along. He'd been silently keeping tabs on events. Once Kirsty banishes the Cenobites and destroys her undead Uncle Frank, the Guardian comes to retrieve the box from the ashes of Larry's house. In other words, Hell's not about to let its precious summoning device get lost or destroyed in a fire, so the dragon dude grabs it and returns it to the original keeper. That is, the puzzle merchant first sold it to Frank. And this way, the cycle continues. Now, what happened to the creature after that? Well, according to the movies, basically nothing. He never appears again in any major way. The Hellraiser sequel has a blink and you'll miss it scene, but that's no significant role. Aside from that, the Dragon Guardian is MIA for the rest of the series. However, that's not the case with the comics, where Guardians, yeah, more than one, often appear, and they're essentially created by this Cenobite called Orno. So this guy was never interested in flesh. For most Cenobites, the body was a canvas, but for Orno, it was a container that was equal parts crude, temporary, and inconvenient. His obsession belonged to something much more complex. We're talking about the mind. Introduced in Maze of the Mind from Hellraiser number 5, Orno built doorways. He treated hell like an algorithm, and Leviathan loved him for it. His reward was a private laboratory within hell itself, where he shaped the future of damnation one box at a time. He also created the Eremites, who were born from flesh seeded by Orno. 16 years after conception, that child receives a puzzle box. The Eremite who receives it becomes its guardian. The child is bound to the box by blood, thought, and instinct. Where Cenobites usually work in groups, the Eremites walk alone. The most interesting thing about them, apart from their birth, is that they can hide in plain sight. They might appear as a child, an addict, a cat on your porch, literally anything that won't scream danger. They also serve as dealers for the puzzle box, and when you meet one, there's always that question of, what's your pleasure, sir? You might think you're in for a really good time, but you're actually ending your own life. What happened to major characters who simply disappear? Over 11 Hellraiser films, and we've met quite a few characters who survived one movie only to vanish from the franchise without so much as a goodbye cameo. Horror movie franchises often have recurring heroes or at least some continuity of characters, but Hellraiser has a habit of dropping its major actors and characters as if they solved the box in real life. So, who are these disappearing acts and what happened or didn't happen to them? Top of the list, we've got Tiffany, the young puzzle-solving savant from Hellraiser 2. Tiffany was crucial to defeating Shenard and Leviathan. She survives Hell's Labyrinth alongside Kirsty and escapes back to Earth. You'd think such a resourceful character would show up again. I mean, she literally saved herself from a Cenobite-ruled hell. But after Hellbound, Tiffany is never seen or mentioned in the films again. No sequel ever explains where she went. Did she go live a happy, puzzle-free life? Did the Cenobites leave her alone since she didn't truly summon them? We don't know, but the confirmed part is that Kirsty and Tiffany left Hell together alive. Next, we've got Joey Summerskill, the reporter protagonist of Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth. Joey goes through Hell, on Earth no less, to stop Pinhead's rampage in 1992. She succeeds in sending Pinhead back to Hell using the puzzle box and survives the ordeal. The end of Hell on Earth says that the box is encased in a building's foundation, possibly teasing more to Joey's story, but nope. By the time of the next sequel, Joey's story is completely dropped. She doesn't return in any later film, and no one references the events in New York with the Cenobite massacre at the club. Like Tiffany, she was a one-and-done hero. We also have Kirsty Cotton, the original heroine from Hellraiser 1 and 2. Kirsty is actually one character the series brings back, but only after a very long time. After surviving Hellbound, Kirsty vanishes for many years. She finally resurfaces in Hellraiser, Hellseeker from 2002, where we learn she married some poor schmo and, true to form, got mixed up with Pinhead once more. Long story short, she strikes a new deal with Pinhead to save herself, proving she's as wily as ever. But between 1988 and 2002, the franchise just ignored Kirsty's existence. The real-world answer to the question of her long hiatus is that those sequels were originally unrelated scripts, so Kirsty wasn't included. In universe, we can imagine Kirsty was trying to move on with her life, until Pinhead found a way back into it. And let's not forget Julia Cotton, Kirsty's wicked stepmother, and the would-be big bad of the series. Clive Barker's original plan was actually for Julia to take over as the primary antagonist after Hellraiser 2. At the end of Hellbound, Julia is pulled back into Hell by Leviathan, but Coda suggested she might return, well, because of the mattress and the moving guy and the pillar with faces. The studio, however, had other ideas, and they wanted more Pinhead, so Julia never returns in the sequels despite being set up as a major player. We last see her as a corpse getting sucked into a labyrinth vortex, and that's that. There are other examples too. Detective Joseph Thorne, the anti-hero of Hellraiser Inferno, is dragged off to an eternity of torment at the end of his film, and since his story is standalone, we never hear of him again, though in his case, his fate was shown as living a perpetual hell loop courtesy of Pinhead. The later sequels each have their protagonists who either die or escape, and none are referenced afterwards. By design, most of these characters disappeared simply because each sequel hit the reset button with a new cast. Why does the franchise abandon its own mythology? If you've been paying attention, you might have noticed a pattern. The Hellraiser series has a tendency to throw out its own established lore whenever it's convenient, as it does with its characters. Rules set in one movie get broken in the next, major plot elements vanish, and the entire thing changes from otherworldly horror to slasher and back again. So yeah, why do the Hellraiser films do this to themselves? Well, the answer lies in what happens behind the scenes thanks to the real agents of hell, people called studio executives. You see, after Hellbound Hellraiser 2, Clive Barker chose to stop his direct involvement in the Hellraiser movies. He had intended a certain direction for the story, and like we said earlier, he famously wanted Julia to become the new villain and Pinhead to leave the franchise. But the studio wanted to keep Pinhead as the figurehead and keep the series going as a more commercial horror franchise. I mean, they wanted Pinhead to serve as Michael or Freddy. Without them, their franchises were nothing. So, starting with Hellraiser 3, new writers and directors came in, and they didn't necessarily honor all the fine points of Barker's novella or his ideas about the series. Pinhead got turned into a quip-slinging, slasher-esque villain because that's what was popular in the early 90s. The downside was that this approach watered down Barker's unique concept into something more generic. The franchise's identity transitioned from explorers in the further regions of experience to scarred dude with nails who hooks people because he can. By Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth, much of the established mythology, like Leviathan and the idea that Cenobites only come when summoned by desire, was discarded in favor of a simpler good versus evil fight on Earth. This also meant that the Cenobites had to be treated like demons from hell who are simply bad guys without any gray in them. The very notion that they were once neutral experimenters in sensation was lost, and now Pinhead was happily evil and murdered indiscriminately. This was a fundamental change in the lore and tone. Then came Hellraiser Bloodline, which told the history of the box across centuries and even introduced an opposite Elysium configuration to destroy Hell's Gateway. Admirably ambitious, but it was meddled with and ended up a mess, so much so that director Kevin Yeager chose to remain uncredited and allowed the use of the name Alan Smithy. After that, the franchise went straight to video and things really went off the rails. Several sequels like Inferno, Hellseeker, Deader, and Hellworld weren't even originally written as Hellraiser movies. Can you imagine? No wonder these movies turned out to be shit. We'll tell you what they did too. So, Dimension Films repurposed unrelated horror scripts and shoehorned Pinhead and the puzzle box into them to keep the franchise alive, only because they wanted to retain the rights. Naturally, these films barely touch on any prior lore because their stories weren't conceived with Hellraiser's mythology in mind. For example, Hellraiser Inferno plays out like a standalone Twilight Zone-ish detective horror, where Pinhead is more of a Twilight Zone host. Hellraiser Hellworld is literally about a Hellraiser video game and mostly takes place in a dream hallucination. Probably the only interesting thing about it is Henry Cavill, who starred. So that's kind of how studio executives screwed over this franchise, but why? Why is always because of greed. What is the true timeline of the franchise? Now, here's a question that gave me a headache while we were working on the script for this video, kid you not. If you attempt to plot out the Hellraiser films on a single timeline, well, good luck, because there are chances you'd prefer summoning a Cenobite instead because the continuity is notoriously tangled. But we'll still try to determine the true timeline to the extent such a thing exists. The first two movies are pretty straightforward. Hellraiser and Hellbound Hellraiser 2 take place back-to-back in the late 1980s, with Hellbound picking up just hours or days after the first. Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth, is set in 1992, the year it was released, a few years after the events of 1 and 2, and we follow new protagonist Joey in New York as Pinhead is resurrected. Part 3 ends with Pinhead confined back to Hell and the puzzle box turned into an architectural ornament. Then comes Hellraiser Bloodline from 1996. Now, this movie is essentially three timelines in one. The first starts in 18th century France, when the Lament Configuration was built by Philippe Le Marchand. The next is set in modern-day 1990s America, and it follows John Merchant, a descendant of Le Marchand, and the last one is from the far future of 2127, just 5 years before Ellen Ripley met her nemesis, oh, sorry, that's a different franchise, my bad. Jokes aside, Bloodline's finale is set in 2127, where Dr. Paul Merchant, another descendant of the famous toy maker, tricks Pinhead, permanently closes the gateway to Hell, and also kills Pinhead in the process. If we take Bloodline at face value, Pinhead dies for good in 2127, and Hell's door is shut. So, at least one timeline endpoint is the year 2127, Pinhead's destruction. Now, everything after Bloodline gets confusing because the franchise kept going, but obviously couldn't continue after 2127, and thankfully no one was clamoring for Hellraiser in the year 3000. Instead, The next films go to a contemporary setting and largely ignore Bloodline's ending. According to official notes, all the direct-to-video sequels, that is Hellraiser 5 through 8 and even 9 and 10, chronologically set before that 2127 future where Pinhead dies, so these movies take place between Hellraiser 3 and the space finale of Bloodline. In other words, the series branches off into standalone stories that happen sometime in the 90s and 2000s. So the true timeline would place Hellraiser Inferno, Hellseeker, Deader, Hellworld, Revelations, and Judgment in some nebulous time frame around the turn of the 21st century, which makes them midquels, or can we call them sidequels? Is that even a thing? We need your help, audience. What are these movies called? However, the timeline is only part of the confusion because continuity is another. Even if chronologically things could line up, the films often ignore events from previous films. For example, Hellseeker has Kirsty but never mentions she had an experience with a giant labyrinth god or a Cenobite battle that started because of a bloody mattress. Furthermore, Hell is so meta in Hellraiser that it treats Pinhead as fiction until he turns real at the very end. So, is it possible that maybe, just maybe, some characters from their respective films didn't live in the same reality as the earlier films? You might have to consider the possibility that some of these sequels aren't in the same universe as the first 4 films at all. But anyways, we guess officially we can assume they are, just without cross-references. The bottom line is that Hellraiser's timeline is as convoluted as Leviathan's Labyrinth.
What's the matter, Kirsty?
How did Frank Cotton actually escape hell? Frank Cotton's escape from the Cenobites in the first Hellraiser is the very thing that starts the entire bloody story, and yet the movie conveniently chooses not to tell us the how. We see Frank get literally torn to pieces by Pinhead's chains and dragged to hell at the start. Normally, that should be a one-way ticket, but later, thanks to a bit of spilled blood in the attic, Frank manages to crawl his way back to the land of the living. We agree he was slimy and skinless, but undeniably free of hell. How on earth, or rather how in the hell, did he pull that off? What we know from the film is that Larry, Frank's brother, bleeds on the spot where Frank was taken, and this somehow resurrects Frank's remains from under the floorboards. The extremely gross and gooey regeneration scene shows Frank forming out of that mix of blood and gore. Essentially, a blood sacrifice occurred at the exact place Frank left the mortal world, and that opened a door for him to slip out of hell's grasp. The Cenobites, for their part, are completely surprised that Frank escaped. In fact, when Kirsty tells Pinhead Frank's alive, Pinhead basically goes impossible and is visibly miffed that one of their victims gave them the slip. I mean, the man's ego was hurt. This means that escapes from hell are exceedingly rare, and Frank might even be the first in eons to manage it, and that's why the Cenobites had no idea until they were informed. Essentially, they didn't care about their security because it was something so impossible. So, in concrete terms, Frank's escape happened because of blood magic, irrespective of it being intentional or accidental. The movie doesn't explain any more than what we see. That's Larry's blood plus the attic equals Frank's second chance. However, Clive Barker's novella, The Hellbound Heart, on which the movies are based, sheds more light on this. In the book, it wasn't just blood that did the trick, but the combination of Larry's spilled blood with Frank's own lingering essence. You see, in a very Barker-esque manner, Frank had ejaculated on the floorboards just before being taken by the Cenobites, and that remained as a sort of quote-unquote seed of himself. The movie toned this down, no idea why, not like it was a children's movie, but effectively the idea is that some physical remnant of Frank, however icky, plus some fresh blood, created a bridge between Hell's dimension and our world, which basically allowed Frank to reconstitute himself. Now, the other question that arises is, why doesn't this happen more often? The escape, well, first, not many people get Cenobited while conveniently having a brother spill blood on the exact spot later. Second, it's implied the Cenobites generally clean up any trace of their victims, so Frank just got lucky. That is, if you can call his condition lucky.
We meet again.
How did you find me?
Why is Larry Cotton in hell? This question used to annoy me ever since I watched Hellraiser Hellseeker. So, Larry Cotton was Kirsty's loving father, right? He was a good guy and simply a victim in the first film who never opened any devilish boxes. He gets murdered by Frank, but Larry himself never does anything to warrant eternal damnation as far as we see, at least not in the Labyrinth. Maybe he did something bad and deserved the biblical hell, but not the one ruled by Leviathan. But the franchise confirms that Larry's soul is in the Labyrinth. Why? In Hellseeker, Pinhead taunts Kirsty by saying, "But he is in his own hell, child, and quite unreachable, just as you are in yours." This is meant to emotionally manipulate Kirsty, but it's stated as a fact in the film's context. So if we take Pinhead at his word, Larry Cotton is indeed suffering in some hellish afterlife. One possibility is that Pinhead was being figurative. He might mean to say that Larry is effectively lost or dead, beyond Kirsty's help, so he was in his own hell, so to speak. Or in other words, he was in the grave or whatever afterlife. Pinhead has a flair for the dramatic, after all. Another interpretation is that everyone has their own hell in the Hellraiser universe, because hell is a personalized experience. A more direct possibility is the consolation prize hell. Since Larry didn't go to Leviathan's Labyrinth, the Cenobites never took him, maybe his soul went to a different afterlife, possibly the regular old-fashioned hell for ordinary sinners, assuming such a thing exists in this universe. The film Hellseeker had a deleted scene where Pinhead explicitly confirms Larry is being tortured in hell because of what happened, but that scene didn't make the final cut. In the final film, we only have Pinhead's few taunting lines. It's also possible that Pinhead took a personal interest in claiming Larry's soul off-screen. Remember, in Hellbound, Pinhead and the Cenobites almost got Larry, and they arrive thinking Larry's skin suit is Larry himself. Pinhead even says, "Come to Daddy," mocking Kirsty with what he thinks is Larry's corpse, or discovering it's actually Frank. So maybe Pinhead felt a bit cheated in Hellbound, and later at some point, dragged Larry's soul down anyways just because. Of course, this is pure conjecture, but what if, hear me out, what if to a Cenobite, even heaven would be hell? Pinhead might be implying that wherever Larry is, even if it's a peaceful afterlife, it's hell because he sees afterlife as hell. There's no version of heaven in his mind, always equates the afterlife with hell. But that's just a theory. What do you think? Why do the puzzle box mechanics keep changing? If there's one consistent prop through all of the Hellraiser franchise, it's the Lament Configuration, that ornate little puzzle box that opens gateways to hell. You'd think the rules of a simple cube would remain, well, simple, but nope. The franchise can't seem to decide exactly how the box works or what it can do, and the mechanics keep evolving or outright changing from film to film. In the original Hellraiser, the box's purpose is to get solved so that the Cenobites can arrive and do their thing, and if you reverse the box, you can send them back. It's basically a key to Hell's Door. Hellbound, Hellraiser 2, makes the box a bit more complex when it says that Leviathan can transform the box into different shapes. But again, that's more like an alternate mode. The core concept is still the same. Then, in Hellraiser 3, things get really messed up. In the end, the box is used to trap Pinhead by Joey when she shoves it into Pinhead's chest and it turns him back into an ethereal form, which the box then sucks in, thereby sending him away. So now the box is a Ghostbuster ghost trap. Also, in the beginning of Hellraiser 3, Pinhead is somehow released, not by someone solving the box, but by the blood of a victim soaking into that weird pillar which contains the box embedded in it. So now just a bit of blood and some deaths in a nightclub set Pinhead free without anyone even finishing a puzzle. Already the whole thing about must-solve configuration to unleash hell is gone. Hellraiser Bloodline complicates things even further when it introduces not only the original box's origin, but also the concept of the Elysium configuration, a reverse box that can permanently close Hell's Gate. Now, the direct-to-video sequels each put their own spin on the box's so-called rules. In Inferno, the protagonist opens the box and then, interestingly, doesn't get chains and immediate dismemberment. Instead, his whole world becomes a nightmare. Pinhead doesn't appear until the very end to reveal that the guy has actually been in hell all along. So, in that story, solving the box basically plunged Joseph Thorne into a psychological hell loop rather than physically dragging him into a labyrinth. So this one is basically a completely new interpretation. Hellraiser Deader introduced a cult that can resurrect the dead without the box, and a descendant of the box's creator who wants to control it. Here, the cult leader can't make the box work for him because, as Pinhead later sneers, only someone truly seeking experience, or with nothing to lose, can open it. The protagonist, Amy, does manage to open the box, which makes Pinhead arrive and settle scores. The film implies the box kind of knows who should or shouldn't open it, so it's suddenly developed a quasi-moral persona, according to which Only those who authentically reach out to it can unlock it, and an impure motive, like trying not to die, isn't enough. That's a nuance not really present earlier, and honestly, we didn't need all this crap. And it keeps on changing. I mean, the way the thing works and even how it looks. The only logical explanation behind this is that each movie had a different idea of what the Lament Configuration should represent. Sometimes it's literally a door to a physical hell dimension, other times it's a trigger for a state of hell. Also, practically speaking, the writers kept reinterpreting the box to fit their standalone story's needs. As I mentioned earlier, many of these sequels weren't even written as Hellraiser stories originally, so the puzzle box was retrofitted into plots where it wasn't the central focus, which ultimately led to some odd usage. Unfortunately, the portal to hell is closing and it's our time to leave because we're out of Hellraiser questions to answer for you guys. That said, if you've got some other ones, let us know in the comments section down below and we'll try to answer them for you. And if we get enough good questions, maybe we'll make another video, like a part 2 kind of thing. As always, the best way to support us is by liking and subscribing to the channel, but otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.